Dear all, I thank you very much for joining us today for the first Tourism Climate Change webinar. My name is Elena Ray and I'm the Tourism and Environment Program Officer at the United Nations Environmental Program, and I welcome all of you to this webinar, World Heritage and Tourism in a Changing Climate. I will be moderating the session today, and before we start and I introduce the speakers to you, I would like to give a brief introduction to the GoToWebinar tool and housekeeping items. Our attendees are on listen-only mode. The presentations you'll be listening today will have 45 minutes, 50 minutes by each speakers. Then we will leave for 15 minutes Q&A questions, and if you have a remark or a question, you can either raise your hand by using a respective button on the GoToWebinar control panel, or write your questions in the question box and we will read them in due time. This webinar will be recorded, and the recording will be available in our websites after the webinar. And just to provide context of this webinar, the UNEP and the governments of France and the Kingdom of Morocco are collaborating within the Sustainable Tourism Program of the 10 years framework program on sustainable consumption and production to provide a series of stimulating and sector-focused climate webinars. These webinars are prepared as a support to tourism sector activities at the UNFCCC COP22 that will take place between the 7th and the 18th of November 2016 in Marrakesh. The present webinar, first of the cycle, addressed the issue of climate change and the tourism activities impacts of the World Heritage Sites. The theoretical support for the present webinar is the report World Heritage and Tourism in a Changing Climate, produced by UNESCO, UNEP, and the Union of Concerned Scientists, and is issued today. I will introduce you to Mr. Peter De Bruyn, who joined the UNESCO World Heritage Center in 2011 as a program specialist, where he's spearheading the development of a new World Heritage and Sustainable Tourism program. Without further delays, Peter, welcome. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Helena, and hello to everybody participating in this webinar. I guess I should say good morning, good afternoon. I don't think anybody is in a time zone where I have to say good evening, but I'll say good evening just in case. I'm going to give an overview of the report and talk more about World Heritage and tourism in the context of climate change. World Heritage Sites. Next slide, please. World Heritage Sites are in fact unique treasures for all of humanity. These properties, both natural and culture, are inscribed on the World Heritage List because they have what we call outstanding universal value. And this inscription is based on criteria that then represents these values. They are from archaeological sites to national parks to churches, and they represent our past, they inform our present, and they belong to all. This is the essence of World Heritage. Next slide, please. These World Heritage Sites are also important travel destinations, and many of them are the top travel destinations in the world. They're iconic, and they have a huge potential impact for local economic development. In this context, tourism can be a driver for preservation and a vehicle for sustainable development if undertaken responsibly. But these outstanding universal values need to be protected. and the tourism stakeholders, state parties, tourism industry visitors, local communities need to be aware of their responsibility and appreciate the heritage values that are key to these World Heritage properties. Next slide, please. World Heritage sites also form an important network in monitoring changing condition and advancing solutions on the ground in terms of climate change. The report is looking at the impacts of climate change to World Heritage sites. It's also looking at the impacts of climate change to tourism. Tourism, many properties are already experiencing pressure from tourism, so climate change acts as a stressor for these properties. But I think it's important to point out that this network of World Heritage properties was intended to ensure the proper preservation of the natural and cultural values of the site that are inscribed on the World Heritage List. And in fact, these networks also form a very important function in terms of demonstrating some of the impacts and mitigating and adapting to build resilience to these sites themselves. And this obviously is going to be critical if we are going to protect these iconic sites. Next slide, please. The case studies in this report are what the impacts are faced with by many World Heritage properties. We selected these case studies based on the type of site, regional considerations, etc. But I think it's important to note that they are only a representative of the over 1,000 World Heritage sites that are in fact vulnerable to climate change. And I think it's also important to note that these World Heritage properties illustrate the urgent need to implement the Paris Agreement, which will be discussed further in more detail in the webinar. Next slide, please. So I wanted to just give a very brief overview of the connections between World Heritage sites, their vulnerability to climate change, and the impact that climate change is going to have on the economic development of some of these sites as they are iconic tourist destinations. As I mentioned, climate change is a stressor for sites that are already experiencing pressures from tourism, but climate change also has a potential negative impact on the economic development of these sites. If these sites are impacted negatively, if they in fact are irreparably impacted, we lose that economic value. And that's not just important to the site itself, obviously, in the local communities, but some of these sites, these iconic sites, have a major implication for tourism as a whole at a national level. So with that, I will leave it to my colleague Adam Markham for the next presentation.
Thank you, Peter. To allow more questions and answers time, without further delay, I would like to introduce Adam Markham, who is the Deputy Director of the Climate and Energy Program at the Union of Concerned Scientists, UCS, an NGO based in Cambridge, Massachusetts, United States, where he leads the organization's work on climate impacts and resilience. In 2014, he co-authored the UCS report, Landmarks at Risk, which detailed how climate change is already impacting important historic and archaeological sites in the United States. So welcome, Adam, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, and hello, everybody. I'm honored to be invited to talk at this webinar by UNEP today, and it's been a pleasure to work with both Eleanor and Peter during the last year as we put this new report together. So that report will be launched publicly at 10 o'clock this morning. It's embargoed to the media until then. 10 o'clock Eastern Time in the United States, 4 p.m. Central Europe. Sorry, I'm forgetting the different times here. That will be available online at UNESCO and UCS and UNEP's website later today. So I'm, as Elena said, I'm the Deputy Director of Climate and Energy at the Union of Concerned Scientists. We are a non-profit NGO working on science advocacy issues and big environmental problems and social science issues of the day. So if I could have the next slide, please. So we're here to talk about global warming and its impacts on climate, on World Heritage Sites and tourism related to World Heritage Sites. So the key thing to know, of course, is that 2015 was the warmest year since records began in the 1880s. The early indications from 2016 are that we are in yet another warm year, and virtually all of the warmest years in the last 100 years have been in the last dozen years. So there is a huge body of evidence building that climate change is happening now, and we are being impacted by it. Next slide, please. So we looked at what some of the impacts of climate change to tourism would be in general. So there are direct impacts, things like sea level rise, more extreme weather events, so rainstorms, droughts, heat waves, loss of snow. In a lot of places there is less snowpack in the winter. Winters are shorter, and that also leads to water shortages in the summer when the snow melt runs out. And in many places, from Australia to North America and the Arctic even, wildfires are becoming larger, more intense, and more common. Also, there's damage to attractions, so beaches can be damaged by sea level rise. Landmarks and landscapes can be changed as a result of a variety of climate impacts. This affects historic cities, national parks, and what we particularly looked at in this report, World Heritage Sites. A big issue, I think, for the tourism industry is a potential increase in insurance costs, where you have resorts or developments in coastal areas that are more vulnerable to storm surge, more intense storms, or flooding from sea level rise because tides and storms are getting worse, then that will increase insurance costs. So it also will reduce confidence from customers and clients if there is more danger in the resorts that they are going to because of worse storms or the potential for something like landslides related to extreme rainfall events. Although there are impacts for all types of tourism, coastal tourism is probably at greatest risk. 60% of European trips, for example, are to the coasts. 80% of tourism revenue in the United States comes from trips to the coast. And so, for example, a sea level rise of 1 meter in the Caribbean would damage 50 to 60% of the region's tourism properties, including 21 airports, 35 ports, and the estimated cost is $10 to $23 billion by 2050. Just in that region. So you can see that there are really significant economic issues related to tourism and climate change. And of course, tourism is also one of the largest economic sectors. It's responsible for 1 in 11 jobs globally, and it contributes a lot to greenhouse gas emissions. It's one of the fastest, particularly long-distance transportation from aircraft, is contributing a large percentage of global greenhouse gas emissions. So there haven't been very many assessments of World Heritage Sites and the risk from climate change. Back in 2007, UNESCO produced a report with some case studies in, but mostly that was looking at potential future impacts, as is this other study I'm referencing here, which was done by the Potsdam Institute 2 years ago, where they just looked at sea level rise and cultural sites in the World Heritage List. And in that they identified 132 sites, including Bruges here in Belgium, risk of sea level rise over the long term. There hasn't been such an assessment of the natural sites yet. Next slide, please. The difference in our report now is that we're looking not at impacts in the future, but what's actually happening now. There's been a huge increase in our ability to understand climate, and there's been a lot of new climate science since UNESCO last looked at this in 2007. And at that time, they also didn't make the linkage with the tourism issue. So here we have a slide which shows a little bit about our certainty in terms of the scientific evidence as to what is happening with regard to the types of climate impacts we're talking about. So if you look on the right-hand side of the slide, the things that we have the strongest evidence for in terms of climate impacting them is heat waves, coastal flooding, and extreme precipitation events. Close behind is severe droughts. And then the things we know a little less about scientifically are hurricanes and tornadoes. So it's difficult to tell whether hurricanes will become more common in many parts of the world, but we do have pretty strong evidence that hurricanes will become more intense, because as there's more moisture in the atmosphere, as the temperatures warm up, that tends to drive storms and hurricanes to be more intense. But we don't have very good information about whether there will be more hurricanes. Next slide, please. Yeah, thanks. So just moving on to the World Heritage Sites, I wanted to talk a little bit about 3 of the case studies that we have in the report. We looked at coral reefs in a couple of places, New Caledonia and Palau, and I just put this up here now because I'm sure many of you involved with protected areas management or with tourism will know that there is a worldwide coral bleaching event happening right now, driven both by the raised temperatures in the oceans as a result of global warming and by a very intense El Nino event. And those two things together, this is one of the most intense El Nino events we've ever seen, those two things together are causing coral reefs around the world to bleach and be damaged, or in some cases die. And that, of course, is a massive problem for tourism in the places where the main attraction is coral reefs, and many World Heritage Sites have coral reefs in them. Next slide, please. So I'm going to talk about 3 sites briefly, Venice, Yellowstone, and the Galapagos. So probably everybody knows that Venice is affected by flooding. They have regular high water times, and this has become such a problem in the city that they're spending a lot of money on flood defenses. Next slide, please. This is the porch of St. Marks Basilica, and although you don't see the damage here, there is water damage to these 13th century mosaics in the roof. Water that is coming up the stonework is starting to damage these mosaics, and there are literally hundreds of monuments and buildings in Venice where this kind of water damage and also decay to stonework and iron rods that hold the buildings together is starting to be a concern. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, there are a series of very expensive floodgates that are being created and nearly finished after many, many years of design and argument and discussion in Venice. They're going to cost over 6 billion euros. The problem with these floodgates is they will protect the city from storm surge, but over the long term they will not be able to prevent the damage from the steadily rising level of the Venice lagoon. So even when huge investments are made in what we would call climate resilience or preparedness projects, there are still ways in which climate can have an impact. And so the future, the long-term future of Venice is very much in question as a result of climate change. Next slide, please. Also, In Venice, it's one of those places, as is the Galapagos, which I'm going to talk about in a minute, where tourism intersects with the climate issue. So Venice has to deal with a huge amount of tourists, and there's a lot of debate about how to manage that tourism within the city. So the combination of tourism expansion and climate change together, these can be a combined issue for places like Venice or the Galapagos. Next slide, please. So moving now to Yellowstone, which is a site that I'm very familiar with. It's one of the United States' most visited World Heritage sites. It brings in several $100 million a year in tourist revenue and supports over 7,000 jobs as a result of that tourism sector. It's one of the last remaining intact ecosystems of this size in North America, in fact in the world, of this type of ecosystem, and it's famous for its buffalo, for its grizzly bears, for its wildlife, and its incredible landscapes. Next slide, please. So Yellowstone will always be there. It's the climate threat to Yellowstone is not that it's going to be destroyed or that it's going to disappear, but that it's going to change. So we have these views of a place like Yellowstone as an iconic landscape with particular wildlife. But what we're seeing in a large ecosystem like this is that the way it looks over decades or possibly a century will change dramatically. Next slide, please. One of the things driving that change is wildfires, which are a normal part of the ecology in North America, in the western states, but the wildfire season has become 2 months longer in the western United States over the last 30 years, which means there are 2 months more for fires to burn, and the fires are becoming dramatically larger and are becoming more intense. And so as you get more fires, that changes the ecosystem, and so many parts of Yellowstone will probably end up becoming grassland rather than the forests that we see, or the species of tree will change. And so the landscapes that we see will change over the next decades. Next slide, please. This is one way that it's changing. Warmer winters are causing insects to have epidemic effects in the forest and killing thousands of acres of forest, the mountain pine beetle. So people come to see the forests and they see large swathes of dead trees, and this is already happening. Next slide, please. Now, moving quickly to the Galapagos, this is a lot of tourists looking at one land crab. So the Galapagos is a place that's hugely attractive purely for its wildlife. That's what people come for. So virtually the entire economy of the Galapagos Islands is based on the tourism industry, and there has been some control, but perhaps not a great deal of control over the growth of tourism in the Galapagos. Next slide, please. And the Galapagos is known for its wildlife like iguanas, sea lions, cormorants, and rare seabirds. What you see there is dependent on the extraordinarily productive oceans around the Galapagos. So next slide, please. This is a cool year, a normal year in Galapagos. This is an El Nino year, so where it goes orange and red, this is warming water, and then when the waters get warm, the food for the wildlife disappears. And so in big El Nino years, there are huge die-offs of the wildlife that attracts tourists, and we're in an El Nino year now. And all the tourist surveys for the Galapagos show that the the reason people come is for those wildlife species, and over the last few decades, surveys have shown that visitor satisfaction in the Galapagos is going down, partly because the number of tourists and partly because there have been several die-offs of wildlife. And so there is a real, if it was impacted by climate change in the Galapagos, then so too will the economy and the tourism potential. Next slide, please. So that's the end of what I talk about on the 3 case studies. Next slide, please. We have some recommendations. I think Elena is now going to talk about these, but it's clear to us that meeting the Paris Agreement of a 1.5 degree cap, if you like, on warming is key to preserving world heritage in our current changing climate. I think that's my last slide, but thank you anyway. Oh, okay, there was one more slide, but I already talked about this, the large percentage of greenhouse gas emissions that comes from the tourism industry. I think I've finished now.
Thank you, Adam. Thank you, Peter. I think that these iconic sites and the data that you have shared with us show the evidence of severe and accelerating climate impacts on World Heritage properties and the need to reduce the risk to tourism impacts. It becomes more urgent, and I'm going to present to you the relation of 2 recent international agreements on climate change and the sustainable development that provides a cause for optimism for World Heritage sites. Next slide, please. So here you are going to see listed some of the sustainable development goals and targets that have relation with World Heritage sites. There are many more, but I would like to focus on these 4 for our presentation today. There are, among of the several targets, 8.9 calls to implement policies to promote sustainable tourism. So countries will be requested by 2030 to have national sustainable tourism policies in place. These, of course, have to link to the preservation of natural and cultural heritage, and this is very important for trying to reduce the accelerating curve on carbon emissions. Unlike its predecessor, the Sustainable Development Goals address cultural heritage in the context of sustainable development for the first time. So the target 11.4 calls for a strengthening efforts to protect and safeguard the world's cultural and natural heritage, and directly reflects the World Heritage Convention, which was the first international treaty to link these 2 elements. The target 12.b calls to develop and implement tools to monitor sustainable development impacts for sustainable tourism. Some World Heritage sites, and the report also show that some of the impacts of tourism are not being managed, and there is a lack of tools to monitor those impacts. So this very much helps World Heritage sites and countries to put these mechanisms in place to support the preservation of World Heritage sites. The target 14.7 calls for increasing economic benefits of small island development states through sustainable use of marine resources, including tourism. These address also the impacts of ocean acidification, conserving at least 10 of coastal and marine areas, and increasing the economic benefits of small island development states through the use of marine resource. So places like the Great Barrier Reef and other coastal areas based in small island development states will be benefiting if countries take action on this issue. Linked also to the Sustainable Development Goals and the 2030 Sustainable Development Agenda, we also have, next slide please, we have also the Paris Agreement. The three main objectives of the agreement are mitigation of greenhouse gases, limiting the increasing global temperature, as Mark was saying, adapting, including solutions for the management of loss and damage, and financing through new commitments, making financing flows consistent with the first two objectives. Our report highlights three important points for the action of site managers and policymakers. They need to prevent deforestation and protected areas, and improve protected areas management. They need to build resilience and mainstream disaster risk reduction and accountability. While biodiversity and ecosystems are treated by climate change, their conservation, restoration, and sustainable management generate significant and practical nature-based solutions to climate change. So terrestrial ecosystems store almost 3 times the amount of carbon found in the atmosphere, while healthy oceans absorb 25% of the annual carbons. An example, 18 Latin American countries pledged to use their protected area system as a tool for climate change. World Heritage Sites could be used as a tool to support climate change mitigation and adaptation. Another point of relevance to World Heritage Site is that in a world that is already warmed by 1 degree Celsius on average, where sea level rise are rising and the Arctic Sea ice and glaciers are disappearing, as some of our case illustrated, adapting to the impacts will require an unrelenting and immediate and long-term effort, no matter how much the bar is raised in terms of reduction and the greenhouse gas emissions. So with these disasters becoming more and more frequent and common, planning for the worst must assume a central role in the development. The Paris Agreement calls to build on a Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction, and a work has to be undertaken by the World Heritage Sites in looking at the risk assessment, adaptation and planning, and resiliency building to prevent disaster risk. The Paris Agreement has also set the world on a course for a transformative climate action to cut emissions, to promote clean energy, building climate resilience, and catalyze climate action investments. The agreement backbone is the transparency and accountability on the steps countries are, and some countries are taking steps forward towards this goal. This transparency is critical for building the international trust and confidence. And the agreement also makes provision for measuring, reporting, and verification. That is central for the transparency of the system. The transparency framework network will provide countries and stakeholders with the information and feedback they need on the progress to improve efforts and policies to support this accountability. We think, and there is some recommendations in the report, that World Heritage Site could be used as a laboratory for building the case for low carbon and resource efficiency destination and economies, looking at World Heritage Sites as hubs for monitoring and measuring the increase of use of energy renewables and improving energy efficiency, reducing disaster reduction, and I think that in this sense this is very important. Together with the finance that it is going to be provided by the Paris Agreement, we think also there is a lot of opportunity for site managers and destinations that where these sites are located to bring visibility for the international community to finance pilot projects in these areas. Next slide, please. So I put here the challenges and opportunities for the World Heritage Sites. Some of them I have already mentioned before. But I think that the important thing for most of the stakeholders working on tourism and in World Heritage Sites is that they have to commit. They have to commit on policies that will look towards low carbon, climate resilience, and sustainability, looking at the priorities that have been set on SDGs and the national determined contributions of some countries that are also linked to some sites and countries that have World Heritage Sites in place. This will also require this commitment to integrate climate science and innovation in planning, and strengthening systems for continued assessment, monitoring, and early warning of impacts. This commitment is important, but we also need action. Action in terms of building the strategy and the action plan that is required for this transformation, but also mobilize resources for the World Heritage Site management and climate change adaptation. Nothing happens without finance, and this needs to be provided if we want to have World Heritage Sites that are ready for this new transition. This action does not happen alone. It requires collaboration and partnerships, ensuring that indigenous people and local communities are fully involved. As I mentioned before, risk assessments needs to be made, and vulnerable destinations and World Heritage Sites needs to prioritize. But most importantly, there is a need to monitor and measure indicators in place. When we were doing this report, there was a lot of struggles in terms of finding data, getting the right indicators, looking at the results and the strategies in place. And I think that to bring the transparency and the data that we require, we also need to develop management tools for collecting data on tourism and climate impacts in World Heritage Sites. And not less important, I think that reporting, disclosing this information, sharing this information of impacts, of tourism impacts in World Heritage Sites to the tourists and to the public sector and to the private sector, also to try to drive finance for for acting on those impacts, but also developing mechanisms together with the private sector to build on the sustainability reporting on the corporate level as well, and how the tourism private sector, the public private sector also work together to improve these iconic places and to safeguard the world cultural and natural heritage. So this is my last slide, and I stop here. I would like now to open for questions. So we have received some questions. Yeah, I have received some questions, and I will start with some of them. The first question is for Peter. Climate change will likely further stress many World Heritage sites already under pressure from tourism. What are some of the approaches that we can undertake to build up resilience?
Thank you, Helena. Well, I think first and foremost we need to better understand the impacts that climate change is going to have on World Heritage sites. Climate change affects different sites differently. As Adam mentioned, we have the impacts in Venice, which obviously have an incredible impact on the tourism and the tourists that are there, and obviously it's gonna be different than the impacts in the Galapagos or in Mount Everest, all of which are big tourist destinations, and all of which are experiencing climate change in different ways. I think that World Heritage Sites, as you said, Elena, they do harbor these options to mitigate and adapt to climate change. In the natural sites, they, through ecosystem benefits such as water and climate regulations, the carbon is stored in World Heritage forest sites. But I think it's really important in terms of cultural heritage, on the other hand, that could convey traditional knowledge, as you said, that can build that resistance from change. And in terms of of local and traditional communities, this also is this knowledge is vital, and it's now, you know, traditional communities on plants, animals, seasons, natural phenomena, things that we refer now more as intangible cultural heritage, that they have a role in mitigating climate change and better managing the sites. But I think it does ultimately going to come down to management, as everybody has said. World Heritage Sites, they have this outstanding universal value, and clearly the management should reflect that. And managing those sites in the face of tourism should also reflect that. So again, I think it's going to mean that everybody working together, the local communities, working with the tourism industry, working with site management, but there are policy aspects to this that can drive change, and I think that again is an important point to make. The exceptional monitoring network of World Heritage Sites, it puts at the disposal to all of the signatories to the World Heritage Convention the knowledge that specialists and whose competence touches upon both natural and cultural heritage. I think that it's these things that are really going to drive change and to build that resilience in the World Heritage Sites across the world.
Thank you, Peter. I have a question for Adam. There is someone, Adam, that is very much interested in knowing how the report has been developed, and where the statistics and the information that you have presented, how they were originated and where they come from.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, that's a great question. So we actually started with a list of just under 100 possible sites that we could think about writing about, and then we narrowed it down. The main criteria for narrowing it down was where we could find really strong, robust climate science that was peer-reviewed, so that we knew what the climate impacts were. And then we looked for a geographic range. We wanted a mix of cultural and natural sites, and we wanted to show the whole array of types of climate impact, from melting glaciers to sea level rise and wildfires. And we reviewed the peer-reviewed science. We looked at technical reports. We looked at all of the UNESCO state of conservation reports that come in to the World Heritage Committee from states parties, and we used also the IUCN, that's the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, World Heritage Outlook 2014, which was a survey of threats to World Heritage sites around the world, but only in the natural criteria. And then the tourism data is actually much more difficult to get. There hasn't a deal of information about tourism and climate change, and we had to rely mainly on national, either international agencies like the World Bank or the UN World Tourism Agency, or national tourism boards. And so some countries publish more accurate tourism statistics than others and keep them more up to date. So it was actually much more difficult to find the tourism data than it was to find the climate data. I hope that helps.
Yes, it helps. Thank you very much, Adam. There is another question. With regards to the linkages of social impacts on World Heritage sites and climate change. I don't know if you, any of you, could draw on some examples of the report.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are huge social impacts to climate change in World Heritage sites. So. And that's both climate change and tourism, because obviously when tourists, particularly in developing countries where there are local indigenous populations and tourists come into those areas, there can be cultural impacts from tourism. So that's one impact that we were looking at when we wrote some of these case studies. And then there are the social impacts of the positive social impacts of having tourists come to areas, because they bring economic benefit. The economic benefit can accrue to the country where the World Heritage Site is. Often listing a World Heritage Site increases tourism to a country and a region. It's important for the regional economy, as for example in South Africa we looked at the Cape Floral region, where climate change is changing the habitats and the ecosystems, and that's one of the most important tourism areas for South Africa's economy. And so jobs depend on tourism, and local communities depend on the income that comes from those jobs. At the same time, people and communities are either in or around World Heritage Sites are directly impacted by climate change. And so just like ecosystems, human communities are under stress in many ways. What climate change does is it adds stress, it increases risk, and it can compound the problems. So if a village is suffering from flooding on a regular basis and that flooding becomes more common, then that increases the stress on the village. So I think that there are massive social impacts from climate change, and I think World Heritage Sites are very much kind of an interplay between local communities, local economies, and then the values that we're trying to preserve. And climate change is dealing with climate change is only going to make that more difficult.
Thank you, Adam. There is a question relates to from Michael Matthews, asking that based on his experience, having put in practice many sustainability policies of the last years, one of the difficulties that he finds is obtaining data. It's very difficult, and there is a lack of transparency in data and a real reluctance to share. Partially because of the competitive nature of the industry. How, and this is both for you, Peter, and Adam, how do you think we can improve the lack of transparency in this data in World Heritage sites and in the tourism industry?
I'll let Peter go first on that.
Yeah, I'll take a stab at that. I think it is a good question because as we've all pointed out, data is a problem in terms of tourism. I mean and there are different reasons for that, as you mentioned, Elena. You know, in terms of competitiveness and the unwillingness to share data. But we're going to have to do better at that, and that doesn't excuse not being able to do that, and we just have to get that data, and that's one of the things that UNESCO is looking very closely at, and how we can identify some indicators for that in terms of visitation numbers, and have some sort of a standard way to measure that, because again it's the garbage in, garbage out sort of syndrome. So you really have to have some sort of standardizations on how you collect that data to ensure that that data is then comparable in order to develop any sort of indicators so you can monitor progress over time. I think that in terms of monitoring, again, because that's going to be key as far as data collection, in terms of data collection, but it's also, I think, monitoring is a critical issue in terms of the World Heritage Convention itself, because there is a requirement on behalf of the state parties to periodically report on the state of conservation. So there are mechanisms out there that we could use to start to gather this kind of information. As it stands right now in the operational guidelines, there's no requirement to report on tourism impacts, and this is something that we're working towards to change, to ensure that we can get this kind of data, because the World Heritage Convention has gradually evolved into a tool of expertise that is now in a position to monitor the progress of climate change and to perhaps suggest practical measures to mitigate and adapt to its impact. And having that central depository of data is going to be critical to that, and I think we need to be looking at that. I think, Elena, you had mentioned that World Heritage sites can be these laboratories, and I agree completely, because there is this infrastructure in place, and it's the only legal instrument like that out there where the state parties have to report back, and there's other reporting mechanisms within that. There's not just periodic reporting, but there's state of conservation reporting. So we just have to change that system, and that's something that UNESCO it's one of our goals.
Thank you very much, Peter. I think it also addresses one of the questions that Andrew Potts has also sent, that mention exactly that ICOMOS and the World Heritage Committee have important policies, but they are almost 10 years old, and there is a need to begin the process of updating in light of the changes of the science and the policy of climate change. So I would like to have Adam's view on that in relation also to the recommendations of this report.
Yes, certainly. I think that's right. There are a set of really quite detailed policies that UNESCO under the World Heritage Committee has had in place for a number of years. And I think there needs to be, first of all, we need to implement those policies, and that is one of the recommendations, because I think states parties to the convention have been somewhat lax in implementing those policies. They've sort of agreed them, but then gone away and worried about other things. And I think Mr. Potts is from ICOMOS, US ICOMOS, is also saying that there is now a need, because we know much more, to update those policies and guidelines. And I think we know more about climate, we know more about the impacts of tourism, and we probably know more about managing World Heritage sites than we did when those guidelines originally came out. I also want to come back just quickly to the data question. I think someone asked sort of where we got some of the data. At least I just came across a very useful website just last week in the US that outlines for every US national park, which includes all the World Heritage sites, in addition to the number of visitors, also the economic impact of those visitors, so the amount of revenue brought in by the visitors and the number of jobs supported by that revenue both inside and outside the park. And that's a new analysis which has come from a group called Headwaters Economics, which is a non-profit in the US. And I just recommend it as I think it's a very good example of making data transparent. That data exists somewhere on the National Park Service's website, but they have brought it together in a user-friendly way. And I think that if we could do that more internationally, then we would have a much better basis for making some of our decisions.
Thank you. There are several questions which are related to indicators in terms of selecting key indicators to measure climate change in World Heritage sites. We have 4 minutes to wrap up. What I would suggest is that we briefly talk about this, but there will be another webinar that we will be focusing on the indicators specifically for the Sustainable Development Goals and the climate change agenda. So and we will come to the participants of this webinar with this answer. I don't know if anyone, Peter or Adam, we would like to make final remark.
Well, I would just say on indicators that there are some climate impacts are easier to detect and determine than others, and certainly sea level rise is something that can be monitored, and a lot of countries have existing systems of assessing and monitoring sea level rise. So that's one indicator. And obviously temperature change, most countries have systems or part of an international system to measure temperature change. So those are the two sort of most obvious indicators, but also things like level of ice melt, frequency of fires and size of fires. These are important things. And length of winter is an issue. In the northern hemisphere, at least, winters are getting shorter, and so sort of the dates of the time that ice comes off lakes or rivers, or when the snow melt begins, when the first snow falls in the autumn. These are all things that over a period of a decade or two can tell you a lot about climate trends.
Thank you, Adam. We have other questions that we will address via email to some of the attendees. I think that we had a very short time to share with you some information about that were collected for this report. This report presents the need to act that is both urgent and clear, and also highlights that there is a growing body of knowledge, management guidelines and tools. Some of them have been referenced in the report. Also referencing management guidelines and policy tools, and those can help us to achieve these goals. And I think one of the things that have been strongly advise in both agreements, 2030 Sustainable Development Agenda and the Paris Agreement, is that the success in climate change and sustainable development will require that we build the networks and partnerships with local communities and businesses, also looking at what is happening at local level where most of the impacts happen, and bringing the tourism industry to join us in this critical task. So I thank you very much, all of you, for taking part of this webinar, and looking forward to see you in the next edition. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Helena.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Thank you all.